Now I'm joined by Travis Lubick, as I mentioned earlier, that he had written the story about social media and how it can actually contribute to feelings of disenchantment among some people. So can you explain how you went about researching this story, Travis?
Yeah, it was a suggestion for a story by a friend of mine who said that they noticed they weren't feeling well when they spent too much time on Facebook. So I started taking some shots in the dark, emailing different universities, asking if there was any research on this topic. And everybody was really enthusiastic. Even the media people who don't appear in the story said they loved the idea and had people on the phone with me right away.
And what were some of the findings that you discovered as you started asking these questions?
We found that Facebook can make people sad. It depends on how you use it. But if you use it as a passive user, if you're not interacting with people and only consuming, it can affect your self-esteem.
And how is that?
If you look at on Facebook, it turns out you're comparing yourself to the things that you look at. So while you take your whole life in your mind, you're comparing yourself to only little pieces of your friends' lives, and mostly only the very best pieces. So you compare your whole life, which nobody's is perfect, to perfected pieces of people's lives, and it's an unfair comparison that can affect mental health.
I'm going to make a joke at this point because sometimes when I compare my articles to Travis's articles, I can have those same feelings of inadequacy. And one of the articles that had that effect on me this week was Travis wrote an outstanding piece about medical marijuana. And this has been a topic that's been of great interest across Canada, particularly as we led up to April 1st when the federal government changed the rules quite dramatically regarding medical marijuana. So Travis, what were you looking at specifically in this story?
Thank you. I should note I have good editors. We were looking at how medicinal marijuana can be used to help people struggling with addictions to more harmful substances like alcohol, cocaine, and heroin, and looking at how marijuana use can alleviate symptoms associated with addiction and also the addictions themselves.
That's quite fascinating. So you're suggesting that marijuana can actually, taking a drug, can actually help you dealing with addiction to a stronger drug?
Yeah, it sounds a little bit funny, and so it's worth noting that it's not for everybody, and we're not saying smoking marijuana is good for you. It's for people who are struggling with substances that are more harmful than marijuana itself, so definitely not for everybody.
And one of the things that people often misunderstand about medicinal marijuana is that it doesn't have to be smoked. And that's one thing is people always think, oh, you're smoking marijuana, you're consuming the tar or whatever aspects are going into your lungs. But I've actually been to the Eden dispensary or other dispensaries where in fact you can get marijuana in a variety of different ways. And one of the things you were looking at, which I found interesting, was Phoenix tears. And can you talk to me a little bit about Phoenix tears and what people have discovered about them?
Yeah, it's quite a powerful form of marijuana. The cannabis concentration is quite high, but it's not smoked usually. It's like an oil that you consume, so you're not damaging your lungs with it, and it is consumed very much on a prescription basis as medicine if you do it the way that you're supposed to when consuming medicinal marijuana. And it can alleviate, as it pertains to addiction, it can alleviate cravings to substances like heroin, opiates, especially harder drugs again, and can alleviate symptoms associated with withdrawal, such as sleep deprivation, anxiety, these sorts of things.
This is very interesting because if the current method for treating heroin addiction is quite often methadone. So you have an addiction to an opiate, you take another drug which may not have the same effects on you in terms of how you interact with people or interact with the world, but it's highly addictive. And I'm wondering, is it conceivable that we could be looking at marijuana as a replacement for methadone to a certain degree going forward?
Yeah, methadone specifically. There is academic literature out there that has tested that exact question and found that it's interesting. The research actually sought to explore how marijuana adversely affects methadone treatment, and then what they found is that it can actually have a positive effect on methadone treatment. So they were quite surprised by those findings. They found that people could actually take less methadone, which is a very addictive substance itself. They could take less methadone when smoking marijuana, and also address, again, some of the side effects, such as anxiety.
One of the things I find surprising is all this information is coming forward about marijuana, and there's even been some research in connection with cancer, but why has it taken so long for us to finally start to learn these things?
Part of the problem is there's a real lack of willingness on behalf of the government of Canada to fund research into medicinal marijuana. There is a lot of research happening, especially in British Columbia, but it's happening from private organizations with limited funds that are at a bit of a disadvantage compared to research in other diseases, because those research in those diseases has federal funding to help research. So the private firms are getting the job done as best they can, but they are at a disadvantage without government funding, and I think that's why we don't know as much about the benefits of medicinal marijuana as we do other drugs.
And can you just briefly go over some of the changes that took place on April 1st for people who are either using medicinal marijuana or people who have family members who might be requiring it?
Yeah, right across the country on April 1st, the rules changed for medicinal marijuana. Whereas people used to be able to grow with a license and prescriptions, people used to be able to grow their own medicinal marijuana for diseases like pain, especially cancer. On April 1st, the government said they could no longer do that, and that all medicinal marijuana had to be obtained in dry form via mail order through a small list of large suppliers. I think there's about 12 registered across the country right now. That's played out a little differently in British Columbia. City Hall, our city councillors, as well as the Vancouver Police Department, have said it's not going to be a huge priority dealing with this right away. So what's happening on the ground is a little bit different, and many people, I'm told, are continuing to grow their own medicinal marijuana. But the rules say you can't, and that's why you get medicinal marijuana dispensaries sort of operating in a little bit of a gray area right now.
So it sounds like if you want to use medicinal marijuana, you may want to move to Vancouver. And that is a reflection of our police department in Vancouver to date, at least, and that's not necessarily going forward. Because in the past, I remember in 2004, there was a massive Vancouver police raid on a marijuana shop on Commercial Drive called Dakine. I'm going to close this segment of the show with news of an apology coming from the federal or from the provincial government for historical wrongs against the Chinese community. And in the legislature next Thursday, it's expected that this apology will be issued, and it's raised a considerable amount of controversy. The Head Tax Families Society of Canada and their chief spokesperson, Sid Tan, has been very upset about how the government is dealing with this issue, because there's no talk of individual compensation for families that paid the head tax. Started at $50 in 1885, went up to $100 in 1900, up to $500 in 1903, and by 1923 legislation was introduced federally by the Liberal government of the day to basically ban Chinese immigration, and that remained in place to 1947. But that isn't the only historical wrong. There was a raft of legislation, which you can find on the BC government webpage, banning Chinese from employment in numerous areas, from voting, from buying crown land. So there's been a huge amount of kind of historical wrongs that took place. At first, the BC government talked about an apology for the head tax. And that was something that bothered many people, including Bill Chu of Canadians for Reconciliation, because Bill Chu was saying that, well, why apologize just for the head tax? There's a whole bunch of things. And he's argued that he would like to see reconciliation as opposed to an apology, which has put him at odds with other activists in the community. Bill Chu would like a model similar to New Westminster, when the city issued the first apology, actually, in British Columbia for the treatment of Chinese Canadians. And it was a very inclusive process. Part of the issue was the secondary school was built on top of Chinese graves of the pioneers. But they seem to have worked things out very well with huge community participation. And Bill Chu's biggest regret is that we didn't have that at the provincial level. So for WOW TV, I'm Charlie Smith, editor of the Georgia Straight, and I'll see you next week.
感谢收看今天的大温故事，我们下期再见。